What up, peeps? It's your boy Heckin Steve, and I'm here with M. Seamer. And today we are talking about the 9 generations of gaming. Episode 2, we'll be talking about Generation 3, which was known as the 8-bit era and began in July of 1983. The 3 major players were Nintendo with the Famicom NES, Sega with the SG-1000 Master System, and of course Atari with the 7800. M. Seamer, how you doing today, man? How you feeling about talking about Generation 3?
It's probably my favorite generation. It gets hard to separate that from the 16-bit era, but yeah, the 16-bit era was great by extension and literally by extension. So for me, yeah, this is the most important generation.
You know, we had the NES, which that's the one that I have the most experience with, just from playing over at other friends' houses and stuff like that, because I didn't actually own an NES until like later on. But I know that it was the leader that generation and essentially revived the gaming market in the US after the video game market crash happened.
Well, they came in swinging. You think about all the black box classics and how impactful all of that was. And I'll be real with you, I didn't have an NES either till much later into the 90s. I had a Sega Master System. That's what I got. There weren't very many people that had those. Just about everybody had the NES. But everybody had an NES, right? I mean, it's just, they had them. So all my comeuppance on that console was at friends' houses, neighbors' houses, etc., and there was plenty of that. And we would do a thing too where we would trade out consoles for the week so they could try the Sega out. I'd get an NES in the house. I'd run up to Blockbuster, rent some stuff. So that was how I came up playing the NES. I didn't actually own one, but ownership of this console was so widespread, you really couldn't get away from it. I mean, it was part of the time. It's ingrained in that era. It was an era that gave birth, obviously, to easily the most important franchises, many of which, again, obviously are still going today. So it's important to kind of break that down, though, and really not dismiss the magnificence of that, right? Because it's easy to just say, oh yeah, the whole thing was cool, but when you start breaking it down into pieces and peeling back layers, even today with all the technology we have, it really can't even compare to the magnificence of what was coming out back then, really to scale given what they had to work with. So
the 8-bit era also introduced game cartridges that had internal batteries, which allowed the ability to save progress so that you could continue later on. And The Legend of Zelda was one of the first games that I realized, could do that. I thought that was really cool. I mean, that really changed the game, no pun intended.
You mentioned the SG-1000 too, and that's a wild one to me as it predated the Master System by just a little bit. That's a console I can tell you for sure. Nobody I knew had one. Nobody I knew anything about that. I mean, there's just, that wasn't something that we saw. It wasn't something that I got my hands on till much, much later on down the line. But yeah, we didn't even know that stuff existed. And it's cool to go back now and play some of the versions of Master System games on that, because of course it's a little more prehistoric looking, but it has a charm to it too. It's amazing just to see it. Yeah, the Sega Master System, it just, while it had this very small library, everything it did very, very well. And in my opinion, it outshined Nintendo with its competitive products, directly competing games on games almost every time. And I did a special on this many years back on the channel before I actually had any viewership to witness it. There's a lot of games that Sega did that, it was their counterpart. It was their version of something. Like, for instance, NES, everyone had Rad Racer. Like, you didn't go to somebody's house that didn't have Rad Racer. They may not, but they probably do. But then you had Outrun on the Master System, right? So here's your red car racers. Which one did it better? Outrun opened our doors to this non-linear racing system where you could decide your path. It had these epic soundtracks that they had to be jamming to come up with those. This wasn't just some generated thing. Not putting Rad Racer down, just saying this is a really good example of how much care the developers of the Master System games actually took in crafting these experiences. Pound for pound, a lot of them were much better than what you would have got on the NES, but obviously without an NES, you sacrifice the access to all those great franchises, especially once we get into the late 80s. It defined gaming. It isn't even up for debate. I mean, we're still feeling reverberations from back then today in the industry, in the market.
The NES was impressive for the time, but still quite primitive. I remember, booting a game was sometimes tricky. You'd have to put it in the little slot, close the little flap, and then the screen would flicker, and then you would have to take it out, and it always said don't blow into the cartridge on the little warning label on the cartridge, but everybody did that, and then you'd put it back in and it would somehow miraculously work. Maybe you would even run into a game that was, it still wasn't working, so you'd have to pull out the old Q-tip with the rubbing alcohol trick. I think struggling to try to get the game to work back then was kind of part of its charm and made it more exciting, once you were able to actually get it working to play.
It was a constant challenge, and it really spoke to how dirty people let these things get, because later on in life, obviously, I'm hunting games out there and I'm Q-tipping these pins, and you're pulling stuff out everywhere from Kool-Aid syrup, spaghetti sauce. There's no limit. What were you eating with it? I mean, is it a fork? I mean, it's unbelievable how bad these things got. So what would happen, even if it wasn't anything that extreme, it would just get this buildup, and you'd cram it down in the teeth and the receptacle, and it would compact dirt and dust all over that thing to where eventually it just couldn't read it anymore. And when you're a little kid, everybody's sitting there blowing in it till they go red-faced, and it's like, I knew that wasn't doing anything back then. I'm not trying to rank myself over everybody. I just knew that that's not doing anything. So I would always sit back and let whoever was blowing in it just do their thing. Maybe it'll work. Maybe we'll play. But I remember when I had the aha moment in my youth where it's like, if you took a Q-tip and cleaned in there, I wonder what would happen. And when I saw the first time I did it, what I saw came off on the Q-tip was like, oh my God, it's this dark gray matter, almost black. It's just like soot on there. And it's like, and then every game that I had collected up to that point that didn't work or didn't work well was just fine. And from then on, I was like, okay, well, that's what you do. But yeah, the design overall wasn't great simply because of that door. I'm not knocking the 001 model. I love it. It's as iconic a console as there can be. But we got to be real. That was not the best design because you can't get in there to do anything about it. Yes, you can take all the dadgum screws out, pull it apart, pull off the metal thing, do the whole 9 yards. I'm just suggesting definitely a kid doesn't want to do that. Once you got past the mid 80s there, we really started getting hit with games that were beyond anything we could imagine in the terms of quality. The initial, and again, I talk about the black box set on NES, obviously some really great stuff in that library, but there was also some games back then on NES that weren't that great. It definitely did not use the amount of beef that console actually brought to the table. There were some games that were just like Tag Team Wrestling comes to mind. I think Data East put that one out. Horrible game. Just absolutely, it looks like an Atari game. It's absolutely horrible. Again, it doesn't make use of what the console can do, but it was games like that where it's like, okay, Nintendo has like 300 some games. It's like, well, great, but how many of those do you actually want, right? They also got into the edutainment games with your Sesame Street 1, 2, 3s, and just like, come on, bro. So a lot of this library is not something you would actually want. Whereas the Sega Master System, everything that they had was on a poster, right? And the poster came with the games. Hang them up, you could see the whole library, and you could literally just go down the line and see which ones you still needed. And it was just all killer, no filler. I mean, there might have been a couple of games that weren't as good as others, but all in all, that library was just stacked. I can't stress it enough because you have a lot of creators that have been told from other people down the line that that's just a system that's not worth your time. And I've heard that sentiment echoed since I've been on YouTube over the past 8-9 years, whatever it's been. And that just couldn't be more wrong. I mean, if you don't care to experience Sega, you're just selling yourself short. Because there's a lot going on that Master System that was just fantastic.
Yeah, I've always heard that too. I've always heard people dunk it on the Master System, but you made it sound like I missed out on something special. So
everybody you knew had an NES. It was like a VCR. I mean, I knew people that didn't even like video games that made fun of me in school because I did, and they had an NES, and it's like, they didn't really use it, but everybody got one, is what I'm trying to say. Like every Christmas tree at one point had a dadgum NES under it. So you just had all these different video game journeys that you could kind of intersect lanes with and see what other people were playing. You'd be trading games at school with people. It was just a really wild time. We didn't know how good it was going to get. And to me, 2 years specifically defined gaming. It was 1987 and 1988. And I think about that and it's like, wow, that's like the end of the 80s, right? But for me, those 2 years seemed to last 10.
There were a ton of gaming franchises born in Generation 3. I mean, you had Super Mario Brothers, Final Fantasy, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, Metal Gear, personal favorite, Castlevania, Phantasy Star, and you had Ninja Gaiden. I believe Shin Megami started during this generation as well.
87, that's where we got hit really hard for the first time, because we did get Zelda, and we got Punch Out, and we got Metroid, and we got Castlevania. And I got to throw Kid Icarus in there too, honorable mention, because again, that's another franchise that it survived. I mean, hell, he had a 3DS entry. But especially talking about Metroid, Castlevania, and Zelda, holy crap. I think about, we get excited for 1 or 2 games during a year usually, and could you imagine having all of that come out at once and then knowing this machine plays these great things? Zelda, I was so enthralled by that, I didn't know what to think. I mean, the cartridge was gold, for God's sakes. I mean, it seemed so much cooler than it even actually was. And to this day, I guess it still is, because I'm chasing nostalgia or what have you. But yeah, Castlevania and Metroid just continued to go on, and it ended up spawning some of the greatest games ever made. I think Super Metroid, it's hard to say, man. That's a front runner for me, as far as, you can't deny this is one of the greatest pieces of software ever created, just across the board. Soundtrack, gameplay, graphics, and everything, concept, it's just unbelievable. So to think all that came out in 1 year, that was absolutely just crazy.
You were eating good in the 80s, man.
The Sega releases in 87, and I had to look because I couldn't honestly remember which ones were 87, which ones were 88, just that all these were about the same time. But you mentioned Phantasy Star. I'm playing that again right now on Sega Ages, and it's like playing it again for the first time. It's just terrific. And we got the Wonder Boy series, which is that's mine right there. That's second to none. Wonder Boy freaking rules. Outrun, we talked about Outrun. You had Space Harrier, which I loved, and Alex Kidd, which we're going to be talking about him for another reason later on in the broadcast here. But that was a pretty big lineup there. That's some pretty hot stuff. And it's stuff, not all of it was, but at least Outrun and Space Harrier, those were arcade experiences, right? I played those in the arcade for the first time. Playing those games at home, I'll say especially Space Harrier, holy crap. I mean, the translation to it's just amazing what the Master System was able to do. And looking back, I just remember being so blown away by that. But we talk about, this didn't age well, that this doesn't age well, but these did. I mean, going back to them, it's as great as it was then. It just sits there and it's eternally great. People are like, man, games are a lot harder now. It's like, I mean, not really.
I definitely agree with you. Games back then were way harder than they are now, especially when we get into Generation 4 and we're talking about those Disney games. Oh my God, those are some of the toughest games I've ever played. But Alex Kidd was actually the first Sega mascot, which was something, that was something I didn't know until I started doing research for this video. Sonic came, a little later on, but Alex Kidd was the OG.
It seemed like Sonic did come so much later on, because I was practically a teenager at that point. But Alex Kidd was the first thing that we really had to look to. And also alongside that, and this is debatable which was which, you also had Opa Opa from Fantasy Zone and the Zillion anime, the little space pod with the wings. That was also mascot. You would see Opa Opa everywhere. And the Zillion anime, by the way, all the episodes are on YouTube. Highly recommended if you're a classic anime fan. But Zillion was a terrific game. Fantasy Zone was a terrific game. And Alex Kidd, as awesome as he was, that franchise just came out of the gate bucking and bronking, and then it just tripped and fell into a pile of its own crap, because The Lost Stars, the sequel, was horrible. I mean, just couldn't have been worse. And then the Alex Kidd in High Tech World was just a piece of garbage. It was an absolute piece of garbage. But then they came back with Enchanted Castle on the Genesis, and they went back to their roots with it, and it was like, here we go, now this is okay. Now why couldn't the last two games have been like this?
The character Mario became an icon almost right from the start. He of course made his debut in Donkey Kong in the arcade, but when Super Mario Brothers came out, it pretty much changed everything.
Mario Brothers itself too, the fact that that actually had, Atari releases, that was always cool to me. Even back then it was cool because it was like, this almost shouldn't exist. Even then, again, that looked wild because by the time I was really getting into gaming, the NES had hit home, and it was like, okay, that's kind of wild that they have him over there and he is actually so here. That always just looked weird to me. Mario, when you think about it, just has transcended everything. You don't need me to tell you that. But yeah, we just had no idea what was going to happen with Mario, at least not at that point. I think it became pretty evident as of the point we begged for Mario 2 and got it. If any character was executed flawlessly, it was Mario. There's just not a whole lot of low points to the plumber's career.
Super Mario Brothers was actually the first game that I ever played on the NES. I was over at a cousin's house, and I'd never even seen a Nintendo Entertainment System up to that point. I had only been aware of the Game Boy because that's all I really had when I first, got into gaming. I remember seeing it and being like, what is that? And they're like, this is Nintendo and this is Super Mario. And I just had a lot of fun, and I didn't even really play. I just kind of like watched, but man, it was just a lot of fun. And then later on, I got to experience Super Mario Brothers 2, which I remember at the time, people were like very critical of that game because it was so different from Super Mario Brothers 1. And then of course they returned to form and enhanced with Super Mario Brothers 3, which was, in my opinion, one of the best Super Mario games ever made.
The best. I'll say it, the best.
You were talking about soundtrack, level design, graphics, everything, the whole experience. That game is 10 out of 10, the Super Mario Brothers 3.
When Mario 2 came out, it was like you said, obviously it was different. And we didn't know then, obviously, about Doki Doki Panic or whatever the hell it was they reskinned. We didn't know about that, and we didn't care because it was like, well, we're getting another Mario. Beggars didn't choose back then, right? We were just glad the game was out, whatever it was. We were critical, but critical then is definitely not critical now. I mean, God, I've read so many people complaining about today's Pokemon announcements, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what you wanted them to do. I just can't imagine that. Back then, we just didn't care that much. It had to be really bad, for us to have a problem with it. When Mario 2 came out, everybody had it, correct? Because you weren't going to not get Mario 2. And we loved it immediately. Even though it was very different, I can remember that not bothering me. Whereas today, it probably would. Something stepping away from tradition, that usually always bothers me. But that didn't for some reason, and we got to love that game just as much. And then you had the Super Mario Brothers Super Show on TV, and the cartoon was based on the game, which was completely tone deaf because you can't really spoil a game this old, but when you beat the game, you realize it was all a dream and none of it happened. So none of those characters exist, except that they did exist in the cartoon. But Wart, the end boss, does not exist in the cartoon. It's Bowser. So that cartoon was like a fever dream that adapted and adopted elements from the second game and still kept stuff from it. Was like they didn't really understand what they were trying to make. And again, citing what goes on today, a mistake like that would be nails in a coffin for a product. You can't get away with something like that today. You'd be ripped to shreds in forums and on social media. People would they'd come for your head. But it's funny to me how that was the case with that, and yet it was still so widely successful, because a sequel to a game that amazing almost just gets grandfathered in. You have to just like it. Then we found out that there was going to be a 3, and the only way you were going to get to see it is if you went to go see that stupid Wizard movie. So of course we went to see the stupid Wizard movie. We weren't going to, everybody did, because it was like, you want to see what Mario 3 looks like, you got to go see this movie. So the movie was in a sense already spoiled. You know what you were there to see. It wasn't that great anyway, whatever. But yeah, we got through it, and the whole thing was like a big Nintendo commercial. You've heard people talk about this a million times. The kid, the badass kid with the power glove that thought he was so cool, and but when you saw that game at the end, Mario 3, and I can still remember being there and seeing this in the theater, It was mind blowing. We just weren't ready. It was just like, I mean, you were just like knocked back in your chair seeing those graphics and seeing it on the big screen in, in the film the way they had it. And it was like, man, we're going to have this at home at some point. Even that, though, couldn't prepare us for how great it actually was. I mean, they had an entire strategy guide just for that game with all the maps, information, and intel, because it was that detailed. And when you, again, these are the kind of things where if you break them apart, start peeling back the layers, you really see the masterpiece that was this software. I mean, it just could do no wrong in my eyes. And I know the other great argument is Super Mario World being the greatest. I'm not going to tell you it's not a extremely close second, but for me, it's still second, because Mario 3 set standards that we still have today. And while we still have changes in the mechanics and Mario's abilities all the way to today, I still say 3 paved the way for everything that we have now. And it was a great baseline, if it was nothing else.
So the NES, I mean, it had a lot of accessories, which, still to this day, Nintendo always has a lot of accessories with their consoles. But I mean, it had a light gun for playing Duck Hunt. It had the Power Glove, which you mentioned before with the Wiz movie. But yeah, so they showed off the Power Glove in that movie. The Power Pad was another accessory. And then you had Rob the Robot. A lot of those accessories were pretty innovative for what they had going on in the 80s.
Sega had 3D glasses. That was amazing. I mean, the 3D games, they had a Space Harrier 3D, Global Defense 3D, Maze Hunter 3D. Those were really cool to see the little dude jumping up out of the screen at you and stuff. That was like, okay. I mean, again, in the scheme of things, who cares? But back then it was kind of neat.
The Master System was a console I never had the opportunity to play, but I have seen plenty of the game cases over the years, and they all seem to have that generic looking clip art style to them. And, the actual game, it almost kind of looks like a cassette tape.
A lot of people just don't like that artwork, and I get it. I can look back now from a top-down perspective and say, yeah, okay, that didn't even really look that good. But to me, it looked amazing because my brain equated whatever look that was with what was about to happen. You're getting a new game, right? So the artwork never bothered me, and really it just became very signature. But at the same time, you get it all on a shelf like we have now, and it's all white boxes except for the Activision ones. So it's definitely not as colorful as when you have all the NES carts stacked up and each end label is obviously different colors. But yeah, that never really bothered me, but I understand why a lot of people don't like it. But I did enjoy having the clamshell cases, and that of course went on into the Genesis as well, because those were the cases that survived versus the NES stuff. I mean, it was cardboard, and it was thin cardboard, and it's great when some of it did survive, but so much of it didn't, and so much of it got thrown away. And I'll admit this, I've thrown away an NES box before, as a kid, because you're just like, that's the cardboard box. What am I going to do with it? They give you the sleeve, and you can fit the manual in there too, and it's on the shelf. What do I need to keep the package for?
We didn't know.
It never occurred to me that we were collecting these things. Again, we talked about in our last episode how a TV was considered furniture practically. This wasn't much different. I mean, hell, Atari had wood grain consoles. It was just, but you wouldn't throw away the clamshell of the Sega one. You wouldn't throw that away because the case clicked into it. The game clicked into it.
It was premium.
And it just seemed like it was an extension of the cartridge. It was part of it. So yeah. I ended up keeping all my Sega stuff, but I didn't end up with all my NES boxes because until I was older, it didn't occur to me that just keep the boxes. Why wouldn't you just keep the box? So we talked about those games from 87. 88 is when everything started firing on all cylinders. And on the NES, of course, we got more Marios. We got Zelda 2, Adventure of Link. That was huge. And Contra. Oh my God, Contra. Again, there's another one that everyone had. You didn't go to somebody's house and they didn't have Contra. Everybody had Contra. Just did. And we also got Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. That was another one that everybody I knew had it. I know that game is very cryptic and people are more critical of that one today, as well they should be. But everybody had it. And again, we didn't have the same distaste for it as some people have now, even though it was as cryptic as it was, because we had magazines that helped with that. That's another topic we'll get into just a little further along here. But we also got Mega Man. You mentioned Metal Gear. Talk about what that spawned over the course of time.
Oh yeah.
We got Life Force, which was in the Gradius bloodline. I think is very important to note. Life Force, definitely one of the greatest shooters ever. Just absolutely phenomenal. And to me, this is a big one, even though it's different than its arcade counterpart. We got Double Dragon. And any version of Double Dragon coming home at that point, it could have been Big Bird fist fighting with people. If it said Double Dragon on it, I was in. Any way that I could possibly experience a sliver of what that delivered in the arcade in my own living room, yeah, it had to be done. And again, while it was such a wildly different animal, the NES Double Dragon, it's its own thing to me still today. And it's a taste I've acquired and must have alongside regular arcade Double Dragon. I can't exist. It's not a matter of which one was better. It's that I have to have both because it's both an integral part of the lore, of the legacy of that franchise. Honorable mention has to go to both Blaster Master, which did have future iterations, and Bionic Commando, which also stretched as far into Gen 7. But the original Bionic Commando was an absolute triumph. Fantastic game start to finish. And again, the list does go on. It's 1988 though, and games are starting to look badass. Sega, again, it's much more scaled down what you were getting from them at that point, but to scale because they didn't have the third-party support. But we did get Wonder Boy and Monsterland, to me the best game on the console, period. We got Shinobi on the Master System. That was huge and a pretty good version. I mean, obviously not the arcade version, but a pretty faithful version for at home. I really enjoyed the 8-bit Shinobi. It's so hard a cat can't scratch it, but it was fantastic.
There was a lot of beat 'em up games during the NES and I guess Master System era as well. Of course, you know more about the Master System than I do, but I mean, some beat 'em ups that I remember from the NES, you've got a lot of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games. There was River City Ransom.
Love
and
them.
You also had Battletoads, which was fantastic, and they ended up doing a crossover with Double Dragon.
Battletoads was amazing. I mean, I know that it's a pretty hard game, and it is. And I'm not going to tell you I've finished it. I've come close. That was another one of those I never owned it, but you did rent it, when you could, and I did what I could with it. Even today, I don't think I've finished it. I want to say I've come very close. River City Ransom was so unique. I mean, where else can you beat someone up, take their lunch money, eat waffles, and then go back out and do it some more? That just blew my mind as a kid. 8-bit games and 16-bit games, they always had, if they had a shop you could go in and a currency system in game where you could buy things, that to me just took the role-playing level up another notch, right? Because then you had money, you had a budget you had to manage, and you had gear, right? Which completely changed the game. I'll bring up too the Kunio-kun collection on the Nintendo Switch. If anyone doesn't have that, $20, unless it's on sale, it's probably less, but you'll get all those River City games, the Super Dodgeball games, and your Double Dragons. And wow, what a collection for $20 to have on your Switch and have portable. I can't recommend that enough.
I definitely need to get my hands on that. I tell you, another difficult game, or at least it was difficult for me, for the NES, was Paperboy.
Paperboy is rough.
I've spent hours and hours playing that game, and I tell you what, man, it is so fun, even when you suck at it.
Yeah, something about it. I don't know. It all came down to the mechanics back then, whether or not a game was going to end up being fun, regardless of what it was about. But if you had told somebody, hey, you're going to love this game, you just ride a bike and throw newspapers at people's houses, that doesn't sound that great, right? It really doesn't. Because in my young mind, I'm thinking, well, you don't have a gun, you don't shoot anybody, you don't punch anyone in the face. I don't know about this. But
you stop them with the force of paper. The side of the face.
You look back at the point-based games of the prior gen that really put Atari on the map, and there wasn't much where you would beat people up, right? We didn't really have role-playing games per se yet, not in the full definition of the genre. So we were able to get into some really different stuff once we got into this era, and it gave birth not only to franchises but to genres. I think that's an important thing not to lose sight of. Even though we had dungeon crawlers and stuff like that earlier on with like your wizardry games, Ultima, stuff that was on, home computer, to get that on video game consoles was also just as epic. And you mentioned both Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star, just triumph and genre defining pieces of software. So back then, video gaming itself was coming across to me as more of a lifestyle, and not even just a hobby. I don't even know if it came across as a hobby, in the previous gens. More or less, it was almost a novelty. Again, I can't describe to you what it felt like having the VCS come home and that being my first console, because it wasn't my first console. I experienced some of that, but I was on the cusp of the end of it. But the video games were a lifestyle, and that's what it felt like when you were receiving magazines about what you did, because everything, like, you got Fisherman Weekly or Guns and Ammo, everything that someone's an enthusiast does is usually a magazine about it. So that's how
Yeah.
this was, and obviously that magazine was primarily Nintendo Power, and you would be able to see these ads for all these products, new games, the ratings of these, and then how to beat the games you already had. It had this great interactive feature where you could send in your high scores, you could write in letters to the editor, it had a poster you would rip out. You were all about what you were doing, right? You were smothered in the brand. And yet Sega had Sega Visions on into 90 there. They didn't have it immediately, but for the non-Nintendo stuff, we had GamePro magazine, and that covered everything. And then the same thing, you had the ratings for stuff that was coming out, stuff that had just come out, playthroughs on stuff, all the same stuff. It just really cemented gaming as a lifestyle. When you have this unit, you have software for it, you have magazines about what you're doing with it. It really rounded out the experience to me, and I think that point is driven home by how collectible those magazines are today. I've got a ton of Game Pros. I think it's a full set of Nintendo Powered. I might be missing one or two. I can't remember, but it's a lot. But I love them. They're like time capsules today. You can still open them. And I swear even now you can learn things from them that you're like, oh man, I didn't realize that. Must have skipped over that part.
Those magazines ran for a really long time. I mean, they've only been gone for like, what, 5 to 10 years?
It hadn't been long. Yeah, they continued that for many, many years. Sega had the hotline you could call. 1-900 or 1-800 USA Sega. That's what it was. And you would call, and a Sega dude would get on the phone, and you'd tell them what you're having problems with. And they wouldn't like talk to you or nothing. What they would take you down like an order, and they would send you out like hand typed, like it would look like it was on a typewriter. Not a cheat sheet necessarily, just maybe like a walkthrough. I mean, I guess you can call that a cheat sheet, but it would explain to you what maybe came across cryptic in the manual. These almost did a better job of telling you what you needed to do on games that you would eventually get stuck on if they were built like that. If they were games where it's like, oh, man, who would know what to do here? And in some cases, I had issues with what they sent. Like the instructions weren't correct. And many years later, I figured out watching like YouTube videos, like, oh my God, that's what you were supposed to do. Why did it say that? I've been doing it wrong for 30 years. So there was a lot of things that they would write down that just, it makes me think of Alex Kidd, because at the end of Miracle World, you have the Sunstone, right? It's got the symbols on it. Well, it tells you in the sheet that those symbols, that's the order in which you have to run over the blocks with those symbols at the end to get the crown. Great. I did it. It never worked. The little Grim Reaper guy just comes out and kills you until you run out of lives and it's over. And if you've ever gotten to the last stage of Alex Kidd in Miracle World, you'll know why that's so soul-crushing. If you actually get there, oh my God, you don't want to do it again. But they were wrong, and this is why they were wrong. This is what they forgot to say. And again, we were kids in the Southeast. We didn't know nothing. But in Japanese, you would read it bottom to top, right to left, right? How they read books. So that's how the symbols went too. It went from this way to this way, from the bottom up. So I was doing it in reverse for all those years.
Oh man.
So the Sunstone is correct, but you have to read it correctly. Just an example of why. Yeah, that's just an example of why it was cool. Again, it was part of the lifestyle. That's a very 80s, early 90s thing, obviously, calling toll-free numbers and hotlines, just like you did with wrestling to find out what was going to happen next week or whatever. But again, this was a lifestyle, and these little things just kind of cemented it as this whole experience, and not just sitting down for a little entertainment and walking away from it. While some people probably didn't make their lives that much all about it, for me, I did. I was always just enthralled by development, computers, software, and the next great thing coming down the pipes.
Handheld gaming through the 80s was mostly the Game & Watch line of devices from Nintendo, which were fairly simple little games that also operated as a watch. But in July of 1989, we got the Nintendo Game Boy, and the Game Boy is sort of between generation 3 and 4, but this was I mean, this was my introduction to video games. I had the Tetris game, which was a pack in. Of course, you had the Tetris game on the NES, but most of the time I played it on the Game Boy. And also later on, I ended up with the Super Mario Land game. I had the baseball game, which had Mario in it, a
Really
Bugs
good game.
Bunny game. Yeah, and then I had a Bill and Ted game. Those were the first 5 games that I owned, like ever. And I had some up and downs with those games. I mean, they were, they were wonky, but you had this ungodly green screen with the little adjuster. And still to this day, I hate the color green because of the original Game Boy. But now as an adult, I understand that they chose green as the color because the human eye is capable of seeing more shades of green than any other color. So for a device with no backlight, it made sense to use green. That's also why night vision goggles use green, for those that didn't know. But yeah, this thing was gray, bulky, built like a tank, and took 4 AA batteries. And back then, batteries weren't cheap. But I love my little Game Boy, and it saved me a lot of boredom through rough times in my childhood. Not necessarily match the NES quality entirely, but get close enough to where you're not hogging the TV all the time. Because back then, a lot of kids didn't have TVs in their room. The Game Boy was a lifesaver.
It was, and you were instantly the coolest kid in your class or on the bus if you had one. Didn't even matter what you had on it. It just mattered that you had the ability to play a game right there. Or like the people that had the Sony Watchmen, like the little portable TVs, like, dude, you're at
Yeah.
school and you can watch TV. It's like you're instantly cool as hell. So yeah, it was that. The Tetris version was completely serviceable, really amazing. Honestly, in the scheme of things, I'll still play it today. And Mario Land, you mentioned, that was fantastic. One that really stands out to me from that time was TMNT Fall of the Foot Clan. Very playable and very cool, really great Game Boy game. It's another one of those systems with such an iconic sound that it immediately evokes the nostalgic emotions, when you turn it on. There's just something about it.
But the original Game Boy, that thing was my livelihood for basically like the early 90s all the way up to like early 2000s. So it was a great time to be alive. I feel like nowadays everything is awesome, but it's also like sometimes it just seems like the simpler times like it was back then were, much more exciting because it was just all fresh and innovative. And nowadays it's just like, oh, I have this device that, like you mentioned, portable TVs. I mean, this basically is a portable TV. So, all you really need is this one little block. And, as cool as that is, it just makes it seem like things back then were way more cool and exciting when you had a separate device for it compared to like now everything is all just done on one or two different things.
I think there was a magic to it that had to be there because you were the age that you were. And that's probably the same for a lot of people, no matter what gen they grew up in, as far as the effect that stuff has on them. But it does certainly seem from this perspective that the stuff back then was just that much more exciting because, yeah, I mean, we kind of take it for granted now that you're on services where you get like 4 free games a month. And I mean, back then you got 1 game a year, maybe 2 if you were lucky, because they were as expensive as they were. It wasn't something you could just get every time you went to the store. So yeah, there was a magic about it, and there was a magic in the accessibility of it as a child, not having, not being independently wealthy. Of course, you had to wait on someone to buy you this stuff. But there's no question that that gen really defined gaming, because everything that's come since then is just riding on the shoulders of that big Gen 3 giant. It gave birth to not only the franchises that have continued on for so long, not that later gens didn't do the same, but we're talking about some obviously really important and monolithically large franchises, but it gave birth to the dynamics, right? The mechanics of games that would be, enjoyed forever, to the point where now we're making retro games because we want to make stuff in the image of those, so it still feels like playing those games. They were very much their own style, whether or not it's a style because of the time or the limitations in which it existed. It still is what it is, right? And there was a beauty in that simplicity